In today's lesson, we're going to take a look at forms. So I've already created a forms folder at the top left. I'm just going to go ahead and right click on it, and then I'm going to click on new file, and I'm going to call this index.html. So I've called this index.html just because this is going to be my home page. So I could go ahead and right click on this. So I'm going to click on copy full path, and I'm going to go ahead and paste it. And as you can see, everything is empty. And this is because I have not added anything. So I'm going to go ahead and add the boilerplate by typing in HTML and then enter. And from here, I'm going to type in homepage as my title. So if I go ahead and reload this, you will see it says homepage over here. And in my body, which is over here, I could go ahead and type in you are on the homepage by using an h1 tag. So I could type in you are on the homepage. And if I reload the site, it says you are on the home page, which is great. So from here, I'm going to go ahead and create another HTML site or a page. So I could go ahead and right click on this, click on new file, and I'll call this contact.html. And now that I've typed in contact.html, I could go ahead and type away my code for creating the boilerplate. Again, that's HTML, pressing enter, and now I have my boilerplate. And here I could go ahead and type in form, or I could type in contact. That makes a little bit more sense. Contact like that. And then I'll just type in, this is a form to contact me. So if I reload this, nothing changes. I have to go to this file specifically. So at the top, I could click on index. I'll change this to contact.html. And now that I'm on contact.html, it says this form is to contact me. So I could go back. And on the main page, I'm going to just leave this as is actually. So we could actually go ahead and start changing our code in our contact page. So I just went back to my contact page on my web browser. And I could now code. So I'm going to type in form because form is a tag that we're going to need to actually program our form itself. So we type in form like this. We're going to leave class. We're going to ignore this. So we could just delete this actually. For action, we're just going to leave this as an empty. So there's nothing in here. And we're going to leave method as post because we want to post our form data later on. But for now, again, we could just leave this empty, but I'm just going to leave it as is because I really don't want to touch it because it might mess other things up. So to actually start getting our form set up, it's very, very simple. So first I could type in input. So input like this, and I could press enter. I now have something called type. And type, I'm just going to leave it as text because we're going to talk about this in a minute. I have something called name, which we're going to ignore. And then we have something called value, which we're also going to ignore for now. So I'm going to reload. As you can see, I now have a text field and I could go ahead and type away. I'm going to go ahead and actually change something called a value. And I'm going to just type in name. And we're going to see what's going to happen. So if I go ahead and reload the page, it says name in here. Well, that's because we set the value of the input to name. So if I change this to my name, so if I change this to Gunveer, and I reload the page, it says my name, which is Gunveer. So I'm going to go ahead and also add something to name, and I could call this name because I'm trying to get the person's name. And as you can see, nothing changed just because this is going to be used later on when we're trying to retrieve the form data, but we can't really do this with HTML, so we don't need this name input or attribute over here. So I could go ahead and delete this like that. So now if I reload, everything is still the same, everything works. I'm going to add something called a label. So as you've probably guessed, every single form obviously has some sort of labeling stating what each text box is. So if I add a label over here, and in this label I could type in, for example, name, it is going to go ahead and state that my input box over here is for name. So as my value, I could just type in type your name. So if I reload this, as you can see, it says type your name, and over here it says name. So I could go ahead and actually type in my name now. Oops. So this is basically, we've already created some simple form, but obviously forms have more than one input field. Well, this can be done by first typing in BR for a break-in line, and we'll go over this in a second. And I could go ahead and type in another label, and I'm going to call this one last name. And over here, I'm going to type in actually first name. So instead of name, I'm going to type in first name. And I'm going to type in first name, or I could just type in, for example, George. And for my input, I'm also going to keep this as text. I'm going to get rid of name because we do not need this. And for value, I'm going to go ahead and change this to butcher. So if I reload the page, again, I have first name and last name now. So we've already started creating our form. But what happens if I actually remove the breaker? So if I go ahead and remove the breaker and I reload the page, everything is on one consecutive line, which I do not personally like. But if your website needs this, you could just remove the BR. But in my scenario, I'm just going to leave this with BR like that, and I can reload and everything is the same. So there's many different types of inputs that we can get. So far we've focused on text, but there's actually a bunch more. So I could just type in a few BRs and I could start exploring these. So I could type in input. The first one is, again, just text, but let's do a different one. So I could type in submit. And I do not need name. And for value, I could just type in this or submit button like that to make it a little bit more simple. And as you have guessed already, this is a submit button. And what happens over here is basically we've created this input type. So this is an input type of submit. So automatically our form is going to recognize when we click the submit button, it's going to go ahead and submit the form and it's going to perform an action. So as you can see over here at the top where it says action, this is what's going to happen when we click the submit button. So I could, for example, type in take me to a different page, or do this or do that. But for now, we're just going to leave this as is. And as you can see, every time I press this, nothing really happens just because we don't have any action. But we're going to go ahead and change that in a few minutes. And over here for the input submit, the value over here is just what's actually in the submit button. And that's it. So we're going to go ahead and actually type in another input type. And I'm going to put another breaker. And this is going to be something called a file type. So I do not need name or value again. And if I reload the page, continue, it's going to say choose file. And if you click on this, you could choose any of your files on your desktop and everything should be working. So that's another input type. We could go ahead and get another one. And this one is actually something called date. So we could go ahead and select a date. And again, we do not need this. So again, now we have a date. Now we could choose a date. Let's say the 20th. So it's 21/04/20. Then we could go ahead and, type in another input. And this input type can be radio. And if I do not really need these, so I could delete that. And if I reload, as you can see, I have this little button now, so I could select it, but it doesn't turn off unless I have another one. And then finally, I have my last one, which is input range. And I do not need these again. And I can reload, and again, I have now a slider for selecting the range. There are definitely hundreds or a few dozen more at least, and these are just a few of the main ones. We will be going over a few in a few minutes, but for now we're just going to delete all of these because we really don't need any of these. So I could just delete this, and instead I'm going to use one that I haven't really talked about. This is called color. So if I add another breaker over here, I could type in label, and I'm going to type in favorite color. So favorite color. And this input type is going to be a color input type. And I'm going to delete name and value because we don't need those. So if I reload my page, I now have my favorite color in which I can choose a color I like. So as you can see, I've already started to develop a simple form. But what do I want to do with this form? I want to go ahead and actually submit the form. So I could simply do this by creating a submit input type. So input and I want this type to be a submit, which is often a button. And I do not need name, but I do need value because I want to set the value of what's actually in the button. So I'm going to type this submit. So that way when I reload this, it says submit over here. And now when I click on it, nothing really happens. But we could change this by actually changing the action as mentioned earlier. So the action over here can be, for example, go to the home page, which is index.html. So if I go ahead and actually test this by reloading the page, continue, I could click on submit, and it says now you are on the home page. And again, this just took us to our home page, and we can basically do anything with this. And one thing that you might find interesting is if we go ahead and test www.google.com. So if I go ahead and do this and I reload the page, if I just go back and I click on submit now, it's gonna go ahead and give an error. Well, why is it not opening up Google? It's because we are opening up www.google.com in our directory, because we don't really have any file or folder called www.google.com. It's going to give an error. So we basically have to get something that's local. So again, I could just give the same page so it reloads the page. So if I go ahead and press submit again, it's just going to reload the page. But let's say I wanted to go ahead and actually mail some information to a specific email. Well, how do I do this? So instead of action or contact.html in the action, I could do something called mail to. So I could do mail to, and I could go ahead and type in my personal email. So for example, I could type in example@example.com. And if I go ahead and reload the page, so continue, and I click on submit, it's going to open up my Outlook. So as you can see, I'm just going to show a part of my Outlook or inbox. It basically opens this up, and from here, basically the person that's going to be using the form is going to be able to type up an email in the form itself and go ahead and send it to me. And this will be automatically processed because it's going to send it to the email address over here. So over here we can make a note. So I'm going to go ahead and make a note. Oops. Like that. And I'm going to type in mail to your email address, because it's going to send the email over into this section. So it's going to go ahead and send it to example@example.com. So again, if I click submit, it's going to go ahead and send it to that specific email. But for now, I really don't want this. Instead, I want to go ahead and actually redirect my all my stuff over here to a different HTML page. And I'm going to call this submitted HTML or submit.html. And I could go ahead and actually reload the page, continue, and click submit. But I get an error. This is because I don't have a submit HTML page. And I could go ahead and select the form. I could create a submit HTML page, so submit.html. I could add simple HTML code, and I'll call this submitted. I'll call this submit, and I'll say, you have contacted me. So now when I go ahead and reload this page like this, I can click on submit, and now it says you have contacted me. So this often comes in useful when you are making bigger websites, and when you go ahead and add a sign up or you add some sort of contact page, it's going to go ahead and let the person know, oh, you have actually contacted me, you're fine, everything has gone well. But there's one major thing that's missing. It's the fact that I cannot type in a major paragraph or a big paragraph. That's because we have these one-line input text over here. So how can I do this? So it's very, very simple. I could go ahead and actually just remove the color because it doesn't really make sense for me. And the label is just going to be type message. And in here, I could go ahead and actually type in something called text area. And by default, it's going to have some something that's filled out. But we're just going to ignore everything. We're just going to leave this as text area and text area. This is actually a paired tag. and I could just reload my page, and now I have this massive text area over here, which is resizable. But how did this text area actually appear? Well, unlike others, so instead of having, for example, input, I have something called text area because it's an area of text in which I can fill out. So it kind of makes sense, and it is a little confusing at some times that why can't we just have this as input, but that's how it is. So if you want to have some big areas where we can go ahead and actually type in a message, we have to use something called text area. And besides that, we have something called name, which we don't need, so I could delete it. And right beside that, I have something called rows. And rows basically decides, the whole thing decides about the whole width or height of the form. So if I change this to, for example, 1, I want you to guess what's going to happen. Well, if I reload this, as you can see, this is actually 1 letter high. It's 1 row high. So I could go ahead and actually change this to something a little bit more reasonable. So maybe something like 20, and let's say 20, so it's kind of like a square, and it's made. But again, as you may have noticed, it's not really even, just because again, a letter is a little bit taller than wider. And you may have also noticed that we have type message down over here, even though it should have been up over here. Well, this is because we haven't added a BR or a breaker over here. So if I go ahead and add a BR and I reload the page, it says type message, and I could type my message over here. And that's basically it for this forms lesson.